312 passengers thought she was just another pilot flying them across the country. But when their plane started falling from the sky and F-22 fighter jets appeared on their wings, one word changed everything. Ghost Rider. The most feared call sign in naval aviation had just revealed itself, flying a commercial passenger jet. Before you read this incredible story, please comment below which country you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing true stories. Captain Emma Torres adjusted her headset and watched the morning clouds drift past her cockpit window at 39,000 feet. The Boeing 767 was running smoothly on autopilot, carrying passengers from Dallas to Boston on what seemed like a perfectly normal Tuesday morning flight. Her co-pilot, a young man named Jake Martinez, was reviewing the fuel calculations and humming quietly to himself. He had no idea that the woman sitting next to him had once flown combat missions so dangerous that military historians would keep them classified for the next 50 years. Emma had been flying for United Airways for 8 years now. Her colleagues knew her as a reliable, professional captain who always landed smoothly, never complained about difficult schedules, and maintained perfect safety records that made airline management very happy. The other pilots respected her calm handling of bad weather and her skill during tricky crosswind landings, but they saw nothing special about her background. Nothing that would suggest she possessed combat training that went far beyond anything taught in civilian flight schools. Her personnel file showed a straightforward career path. Flight school in Arizona, working her way up through regional airlines, flying smaller jets between secondary cities, accumulating thousands of flight hours through standard progression, and eventually earning her captain's position through the same pathway that thousands of other commercial pilots followed every year. There were no gaps in her employment history, no irregularities, and certainly no indication that she had once been one of the most feared and respected fighter pilots in the United States Navy. The truth was that Emma Torres had spent 12 years flying F/A-18 Super Hornets off aircraft carriers, executing missions in some of the most hostile airspace on the planet. Her call sign, Ghost Rider, had not been given casually like some call signs that came from jokes or embarrassing moments during training. She had earned it during her 4th combat deployment when she executed a night strike mission so perfectly that enemy radar operators never detected her approach, never saw her weapons release, and never understood how their heavily defended military installation had been completely destroyed until long after she had vanished back into the darkness. The name stuck because she repeated that performance again and again, appearing from nowhere to complete impossible missions and disappearing before anyone could track her position. She flew with an almost supernatural understanding of stealth tactics and combat maneuvering that amazed even the most experienced pilots who flew with her. Her military record was filled with classified operations that she could never discuss, missions that required split-second decisions under conditions that would have overwhelmed most pilots, situations where the difference between success and catastrophic failure was measured in fractions of a second and tiny adjustments to the flight controls. She had flown through thunderstorms that destroyed other aircraft, executed aerial refueling in turbulence so violent that tanker crews refused to service other fighters, and brought damaged jets back to aircraft carriers when every system indicator said she should eject and let the plane crash into the ocean. The younger pilots who served with her treated her with a mixture of awe and disbelief, unable to understand how someone could remain so calm while doing things that seemed impossible. But Emma had walked away from that life 8 years ago for reasons she never discussed with anyone at the airline. The classified nature of her final mission meant she could never explain what happened or why she decided that flying passengers between cities was better than the constant stress of combat operations where one mistake meant death. The military had helped her transition to civilian aviation by creating records that showed only the basic facts needed for commercial pilot certification, completely removing any mention of her call sign or the specific operations she had flown. They created a background that looked totally ordinary to anyone who checked. She had wanted anonymity. She wanted to fly without the weight of expectations and reputation that came with being Ghost Rider. She wanted morning flights where the biggest challenge was coordinating with air traffic control rather than dodging surface-to-air missiles. Jake, her co-pilot that morning, was a friendly guy who had been flying commercially for 4 years. He chatted easily about his plans to upgrade to captain soon and treated Emma with professional respect, but he clearly saw her as just another pilot who happened to have more experience and seniority. When she suggested a small route adjustment to avoid some storm clouds that weather radar was showing ahead, he readily agreed, impressed by her eye for weather patterns, but he thought it came from years of reading radar displays rather than the combat-honed ability to assess threat environments and find the safest path through danger. The flight attendants had checked in with their standard reports about passenger needs and cabin conditions, treating her exactly as they treated every captain, never imagining that the woman in the left seat had once commanded respect from some of the most elite pilots in the military. The passengers behind her were doing what passengers always did on morning flights. Business travelers worked on laptops, families with children tried to keep kids entertained with tablets, elderly couples read books or slept, and solo travelers watched movies through headphones. None of them had looked at Captain Torres during boarding and thought she was anything other than a standard airline pilot who would safely get them to their destination. They trusted her in the same automatic way they trusted that the wings would stay attached and the engines would keep running. Everything about that morning seemed completely routine as they crossed into the third hour of their 4-hour journey. Emma was thinking about the approach procedures for Boston Logan Airport when the first sign of trouble came through the radio in a way that made her instincts immediately sharpen, even though Jake beside her showed no reaction at all. Air traffic control was directing several aircraft to change their flight paths due to an unspecified situation, using language that seemed normal to civilian pilots but contained subtle indicators that Emma recognized from her military background. The controller's voice had a slight tension that most people would miss, and the specific altitudes and frequencies being assigned suggested something more serious than routine traffic management. She was reaching forward to ask the controller for more information when Jake suddenly collapsed forward against his safety harness. His hands dropped from the controls and his head fell to the side, unconscious. Emma's response was immediate and automatic. Years of combat training took over before conscious thought could even process what was happening. She disconnected the autopilot and grabbed manual control of the aircraft while simultaneously pressing the intercom button to call the senior flight attendant. Her voice stayed calm and professional even as her mind was already running through emergency procedures and assessing the situation with the tactical speed that had made her legendary in the Navy. The senior flight attendant responded immediately, and Emma calmly instructed her to check if there were any medical professionals on board while she dealt with Jake's sudden collapse. But even as she handled the immediate crisis of an unconscious co-pilot, Emma's trained instincts were screaming that something was wrong beyond just Jake's medical emergency. The timing was too coincidental, happening just as air traffic control was moving aircraft around in unusual patterns. She quickly scanned the aircraft system's displays and saw nothing obviously wrong. But her combat experience had taught her to trust her instincts even when instruments said everything was fine. She checked the cabin pressure indicators and saw they were reading normal, but something about the numbers made her pause. The cabin altitude was creeping upward slowly, so slowly that the rate of change was almost invisible, but it was moving in the wrong direction. Emma made an immediate decision that would have seemed like overreaction to any civilian pilot, but was pure instinct to someone with her background. She grabbed her oxygen mask, put it on, and switched to 100% oxygen. Then she tried to wake Jake so she could get a mask on him too. He was breathing but completely unconscious, and when she managed to position the oxygen mask over his face, he showed no signs of improvement. She called the senior flight attendant again and asked if anyone else in the cabin was feeling sick or showing signs of distress. The response confirmed her worst fears. The flight attendant reported that several passengers in different sections of the cabin were complaining of headaches and dizziness, and one elderly man had passed out in his seat. The cabin pressure system was failing in a way subtle enough to avoid triggering automatic warning alarms, but serious enough to cause oxygen deprivation symptoms throughout the entire aircraft. Every second they stayed at high altitude meant more people losing consciousness. Emma immediately began an emergency descent without waiting for permission from air traffic control, because every second at this altitude was causing more people to pass out. She broadcast an emergency call on the radio, declaring a medical emergency and informing the controller that she was descending immediately to 10,000 feet where the outside air pressure would be safe even if the cabin pressurization failed completely. The controller quickly acknowledged her emergency and cleared other traffic away from her flight path. But there was something in his tone that suggested he was dealing with more than just her aircraft situation. As Emma brought the massive 767 down through the flight levels in a controlled but aggressive descent that had conscious passengers gripping their armrests in fear, she heard radio traffic that made her blood run cold. The controller was coordinating with military frequencies using terminology that indicated multiple aircraft were experiencing similar problems, and there was discussion of possible deliberate sabotage or attack. The word hostile came through the radio in a context that suggested this was not just mechanical failure, but potentially an active threat situation involving someone deliberately targeting commercial aircraft. Emma's mind immediately shifted into full combat mode, assessing the tactical situation even as she continued flying the descent that would get her passengers to safe altitude. She leveled off at 10,000 feet and checked on Jake, who was starting to show signs of waking up with the oxygen mask on and the higher air pressure at lower altitude. The flight attendants reported that passengers who had been affected were recovering now that the aircraft was lower, though several would definitely need medical attention after landing. Emma was coordinating with air traffic control about diverting to the nearest suitable airport when she heard something on the radio that she had not heard in 8 years and never expected to hear again in civilian airspace. A military controller was coordinating fighter jet intercepts using tactical call signs and procedures, and through the crosstalk between different frequencies, she heard the distinctive sound of F-22 Raptor pilots checking in with their controller. The situation was escalating in ways that most commercial pilots would not fully understand, but Emma's combat background gave her immediate comprehension of what was happening. Multiple aircraft experiencing pressurization problems at the same time, military fighters being scrambled to intercept, and the specific coordination procedures being used all indicated that someone had figured out how to interfere with commercial aircraft systems, possibly through cyber attack or electronic warfare methods, essentially turning passenger airliners into potential weapons or hostages. The authorities were treating this as a potential terrorist attack or hostile military action that required immediate fighter jet response, which meant F-22 stealth fighters had been launched to identify and possibly intercept any aircraft that might be under enemy control. Emma made a rapid decision based on her tactical assessment and her understanding of how military pilots would be approaching this crisis. She knew that from the perspective of the F-22 pilots circling somewhere in the airspace around her, her aircraft was potentially compromised and might be under hostile control, especially since she had declared an emergency and deviated from her assigned flight path without prior clearance. She needed to establish her credentials and let the military controllers know that her aircraft was under the command of a highly trained pilot who understood tactical procedures and could be completely trusted to follow instructions. But doing so would mean revealing the background she had kept hidden for 8 years and using the call sign she had left behind when she walked away from military aviation. She switched her radio to the military coordination frequency that she could hear being used in the background of other transmissions, a frequency that civilian pilots would normally never monitor and would not even know existed. Her voice when she spoke was different from the professional but friendly tone she used with commercial air traffic control, carrying instead the crisp precision and tactical confidence that came from years of combat operations under fire. She identified her aircraft by its civilian registration number and flight number, but then added words that she knew would immediately change how the military controllers and F-22 pilots perceived her entire situation. She said she was declaring the aircraft secure under command authority and that she was executing tactical diversion procedures to the nearest military-capable airfield for emergency assessment and security response. The military controller's response showed immediate recognition that someone on her aircraft understood military procedures at a very high level, and he began coordinating her diversion using terminology that confirmed he understood she had serious military background. But it was the F-22 pilots who provided the moment that would change absolutely everything. One of the Raptor pilots flying somewhere in the airspace near her position, though she could not see him because F-22s could operate completely invisible to civilian radar, asked the controller for verification of exactly who was in command of her aircraft. The controller started to read back her civilian name and flight number, but Emma interrupted on the frequency using words she had not spoken in 8 years. She said her aircraft was under command of Ghost Rider, authenticating with tactical identification codes that she had memorized years ago and never forgotten, codes that would instantly verify her identity to anyone with access to classified naval aviation records. The radio went completely silent for 3 full seconds, a pause that stretched long enough to be extremely noticeable even in the middle of a major crisis situation. Then one of the F-22 pilots came back on the frequency with a voice that carried pure shock and something very close to reverence, asking for confirmation that he had actually heard what he thought he just heard. He repeated the call sign Ghost Rider, using a tone that made it absolutely clear he knew exactly what that name represented in military aviation circles and could not quite believe that the legendary pilot was commanding a civilian airliner full of passengers rather than flying classified combat missions in restricted airspace. The second F-22 pilot, who had been maintaining radio silence while his wingman handled communications, actually broke standard protocol to key his radio and say that every fighter pilot in the United States Navy knew the Ghost Rider stories, that her missions were taught in tactical flight schools as examples of perfect execution under impossible conditions, and that having her on this frequency changed absolutely everything about how they were going to handle this entire crisis. The military controller, recognizing that something extremely significant had just happened even if he did not fully understand the history behind that call sign, asked Emma for her tactical assessment of the overall situation and what support she needed from the F-22s who were now explicitly assigned to escort and protect her aircraft at all costs. Emma felt the years of civilian flying fall away completely as she shifted fully back into combat mode, her mind processing the tactical situation with the incredible speed and clarity that had made her legendary in naval aviation. She told the controller that she had multiple passengers requiring immediate medical attention, that her co-pilot was incapacitated though recovering, and that she needed absolute priority clearance to the nearest airfield with full emergency medical services and maximum security capabilities. She added that based on the pattern of system failures across multiple aircraft at the same time, someone had clearly developed a dangerous capability to interfere with commercial aircraft systems remotely, probably through cyber penetration of aircraft computer management systems, and that all civilian aircraft should be treated as potentially compromised until proven otherwise through direct security assessment. The F-22 lead pilot, who had introduced himself using his own call sign Blade, said his flight of 2 Raptors was positioning to provide close tactical escort and would ensure that no hostile aircraft or ground-based threats approached her position. He asked if she needed any support for evasive maneuvers or defensive procedures, using language that clearly assumed Ghost Rider would be fully capable of executing combat aviation tactics in a civilian airliner if the tactical situation required it. Emma appreciated the confidence his question implied, the instant acknowledgement that Ghost Rider would be capable of flying defensive combat maneuvers even in a passenger jet if absolutely necessary, though she sincerely hoped it would not come to that given the obvious limitations of a commercial airliner compared to a supersonic fighter. The situation developed very rapidly as Emma coordinated simultaneously with multiple agencies while hand-flying the 767 toward the military airfield that had been designated as her emergency diversion point. Jake had recovered enough to help with some basic cockpit duties, though he was obviously extremely confused about why his captain was talking on military frequencies using tactical terminology and being escorted by F-22 stealth fighters. The flight attendants were managing intense passenger anxiety as word spread rapidly through the cabin that fighter jets were clearly visible outside the windows, sleek gray shapes that appeared and disappeared in the clouds as they maintained precise escort positions on both sides of the airliner. Emma made a very careful announcement to the passengers, explaining in calm tones that they had experienced a pressurization system problem that required emergency descent and immediate diversion to an alternate airport, and that military aircraft were providing escort as a standard precautionary measure given that several aircraft were experiencing similar technical issues across the country. What she absolutely did not tell the passengers was that 2 other commercial aircraft had already gone down in different parts of the country, not full crashes, but forced emergency landings after pilots completely lost control of critical flight systems, and that intelligence agencies were working frantically to identify who had developed the capability to remotely interfere with commercial aircraft computer systems and what their ultimate objectives might be. The F-22 pilots were providing continuous information on their secure military frequency that Emma was monitoring, keeping her constantly updated on the broader tactical picture in ways that helped her understand the full scope of the situation. Blade told her directly that they were now treating her aircraft as a high-value protected asset specifically because Ghost Rider was in command, and that additional military resources were being rapidly positioned to ensure her completely safe landing. The approach to the military airfield was unlike anything Emma had done in her 8 years of commercial flying, but it felt completely natural and familiar to someone with her combat background. The F-22 stayed in tight formation, flying tactical patterns that provided both close escort protection and air superiority coverage in case any hostile aircraft attempted to interfere with her landing approach. The entire airfield had been cleared of all other air traffic. Emergency vehicles were positioned along the full length of the runway, and armed security forces were establishing a defensive perimeter to protect the aircraft the moment it touched down. Emma flew the final approach with the kind of precision that came from hundreds of arrested carrier landings in combat zones, putting the massive airliner down on the runway with barely a noticeable bump despite significant crosswind conditions and the extreme stress of the overall situation. As the 767 rolled out and Emma followed ground controller instructions to taxi to an isolated area where emergency crews and security forces were staged and waiting, she could see the massive response being coordinated around her aircraft. Medical teams were ready to immediately board and assess all passengers who had been affected by oxygen deprivation. Security personnel were establishing strict protocols to investigate possible tampering or cyber intrusion into aircraft systems. And military commanders were coordinating the much broader national response to what was now being treated as a major national security incident and potential act of terrorism. She shut down both engines and completed all post-landing checks with Jake's somewhat shaky assistance, then sat for a long moment in the sudden silence of the cockpit, listening to the sounds of emergency vehicles positioning around the aircraft and security teams establishing their perimeter. The flight attendants were managing passenger evacuation under close supervision of security forces who were treating everyone with professional courtesy while also conducting mandatory security screening of every single person. Jake was being thoroughly checked by military medics who wanted to ensure he had suffered no permanent effects from his period of unconsciousness. And Emma knew with absolute certainty that as soon as she stepped out of the cockpit, her quiet existence as an anonymous commercial airline pilot was effectively over forever. The moment she had used her legendary call sign on that military frequency, she had revealed the secret identity she had carefully protected for 8 years, and there was absolutely no way to put that back in the box now. The military commander who personally met her as she exited the aircraft was a full Air Force colonel who actually saluted her with obvious deep respect before extending his hand to shake hers firmly. He said he had heard the Ghost Rider stories from Navy pilots who had served with her in combat, that her reputation in the military aviation community was absolutely legendary, and that her decision to reveal her true identity and take tactical command of this situation had almost certainly saved all her passengers' lives and had provided crucial intelligence information about the nature and scope of the attack. He asked respectfully if she would be willing to consult with the tactical response team who were desperately trying to identify and counter whoever had developed this dangerous capability to remotely interfere with commercial aircraft systems. Emma agreed without hesitation, though she knew perfectly well that once she stepped into that classified briefing room, her return to military aviation circles would be complete and permanent regardless of what she ultimately decided to do afterward about her career. The next several hours were extremely intense as she provided detailed technical information about exactly what had happened to her aircraft systems, the specific symptoms she had observed in the precise sequence they occurred, and the complete timeline of events that might help investigators understand the exact attack vector and methodology being used. The F-22 pilots, Blade and his wingman who went by the call sign Torch, personally attended part of the classified briefing and made a point of introducing themselves to her formally, telling her it was a genuine honor to fly tactical escort for the legendary Ghost Rider and asking detailed questions about some of her most famous missions that revealed just how thoroughly her reputation had spread through military aviation communities over the years, even among pilots who flew completely different aircraft types. The investigation eventually revealed that a highly sophisticated cyber attack had specifically targeted commercial aircraft computer systems, exploiting newly discovered vulnerabilities in the wireless communication systems that modern airliners routinely used for standard data transmission with ground stations. The attackers had been able to send malicious computer code that gradually interfered with pressurization control systems, causing the slow, subtle failures that had affected multiple aircraft simultaneously across different airlines. Emma's rapid recognition of the problem and her immediate decisive action to descend without waiting for clearance had prevented her passengers from suffering any serious permanent harm, and her tactical assessment of the broader situation had helped authorities quickly understand they were dealing with a coordinated cyber attack rather than random, unrelated mechanical failures. Several of the other affected aircraft had not been as fortunate, with multiple serious injuries and even some fatalities resulting from pilots who had not recognized the subtle symptoms quickly enough or had hesitated before taking emergency action. The media coverage of the incident initially focused on the mystery of the cyber attack and the dramatic military response involving fighter jets. But as more details emerged about the commercial airline pilot who had coordinated directly with F-22 stealth fighters using advanced tactical procedures and a legendary military call sign that made experienced fighter pilots react with shock and reverence, reporters began aggressively investigating Emma's background. The airline was absolutely shocked to discover that the captain they had considered completely conventional and unremarkable actually had one of the most distinguished and highly classified combat records in the entire history of naval aviation. Her fellow pilots who had flown with her for years simply could not reconcile the quiet, professional woman they thought they knew with the incredible stories they were now hearing about impossible missions and legendary combat skills under fire. Emma found herself called to a formal meeting with senior airline management who wanted to understand why she had concealed her extensive military background and whether her actions during the emergency had actually followed proper commercial aviation procedures and regulations. She explained very calmly that her military service had been highly classified at the highest levels of government and that her official transition to civilian aviation had specifically required keeping that background completely confidential for ongoing national security reasons. As for her emergency procedures during the crisis, she had followed entirely appropriate protocols for dealing with a cabin pressurization emergency, and her direct communication with military forces had been absolutely necessary given the tactical nature of the threat. The fact that she happened to have training far beyond standard commercial requirements had only helped her handle the situation much more effectively and had probably saved lives. The meeting concluded with management formally acknowledging that her quick actions had definitely saved lives and prevented what could easily have been a catastrophic incident with hundreds of casualties. Though they were still clearly processing the shocking revelation that one of their pilots possessed capabilities far beyond anything in typical commercial aviation training programs. But the real question Emma had to answer for herself was what came next in her life and career. The military was extremely interested in bringing her back in some official capacity, possibly as a senior instructor or special consultant given her unique combination of extensive combat experience and recent commercial aviation work. The airline had made it completely clear she would continue to be very welcome as a captain and would face no negative consequences. Though the entire dynamics of her relationships with colleagues had fundamentally changed now that everyone knew who Ghost Rider actually was. She had to decide whether she wanted to somehow return to the anonymity she had deliberately sought 8 years ago, or fully embrace the recognition and responsibility that came with her legendary call sign and reputation. The F-22 pilots had given her a special challenge coin before they departed back to their home base, a small metal disc that carried the symbols of their fighter squadron and a personal inscription thanking Ghost Rider for showing them what truly legendary flying looked like even in a civilian aircraft facing an impossible situation. Blade had told her very seriously that younger fighter pilots desperately needed to know that legends like her were real, that the stories they heard in training were not exaggerations but completely accurate accounts of what truly exceptional pilots could accomplish when extensive training, natural skill, and raw courage came together under extreme pressure. Emma stood alone on the ramp at the military airfield where her 767 was still parked undergoing intensive security inspection, watching the sun set over distant mountains. She thought about the 312 passengers she had saved, the crisis she had helped resolve, and the identity she had revealed after keeping it carefully hidden for so long. She realized that trying to be anonymous and ordinary had really been her way of coping with the intense psychological stress of her final classified mission, a way of creating emotional distance from memories that were extremely painful despite her professional pride in what she had accomplished under fire. But this emergency had shown her clearly that walking away from who she truly was did not actually change her fundamental nature or eliminate the exceptional skills that defined her core identity as a pilot. She made her final decision standing there on the flight line with the evening wind carrying the familiar smell of jet fuel and the sound of military aircraft taking off in the distance for evening training missions. She would return to commercial flying because she genuinely enjoyed the work and truly appreciated the much lower stress levels compared to constant combat operations. But she would no longer hide her background or deliberately downplay her exceptional capabilities. She would be Captain Emma Torres, who happened to also be the legendary Ghost Rider, someone who brought extraordinary skills to commercial aviation while also being available to help train the next generation of military fighter pilots and consult on critical aviation security issues when her expertise was needed. 3 weeks later, passengers boarding her next scheduled flight saw a captain who looked exactly the same as before, professional and confident as she welcomed them aboard with a warm smile. But many of them had read the extensive news stories about the commercial pilot with the legendary secret military background who had saved all her passengers during a sophisticated cyber attack. Some passengers asked for autographs or thanked her sincerely for her military service. Emma handled the attention with natural grace, acknowledging her background when directly asked, but focusing primarily on ensuring her passengers had a safe and comfortable flight. She knew her co-pilots on future flights would see her completely differently now, treating her not just as a more experienced pilot with more seniority, but as someone whose skills existed on an entirely different level that they could barely comprehend. The real difference was inside her own mind and heart. The acceptance that she simply could not separate herself from Ghost Rider because that call sign represented who she actually was at her deepest core. She was a pilot who saw solutions that others completely missed, who remained perfectly calm in situations that would overwhelm most people, and who possessed skills that had been refined through years of intensive training in actual combat operations that most pilots would never experience in their entire careers. Trying to pretend she was just another ordinary commercial pilot had been fundamentally dishonest to herself and unfair to the people who depended on her expertise and exceptional abilities. She could be both the professional commercial captain who flew routine scheduled routes between cities and the legendary fighter pilot whose reputation made F-22 pilots catch their breath in shock and reverence, because both roles drew on exactly the same fundamental capabilities and absolute commitment to excellence that defined her as an aviator. She was Ghost Rider, And that meant she would do whatever was necessary to protect her passengers and complete her mission successfully, just as she always had, whether in the cockpit of a supersonic fighter jet or on the flight deck of a massive commercial airliner. The aircraft type and the uniform might change, but the pilot behind the legendary call sign remained exactly who she had always been. Someone who appeared when desperately needed and executed the impossible with precision that made it look easy. That was what Ghost Rider meant. And she would carry that identity forward into whatever challenges came next, ready to handle them with the same legendary skill that had made experienced F-22 fighter pilots catch their breath in shock and genuine reverence when they realized who was coordinating with them during that emergency. One word had changed everything. And Emma Torres was finally at peace with who she truly was.